Okay, so we are in Primitive Mythology, the first volume of Joseph Campbell's Masks of God. We're up to Chapter 8, the Paleolithic Caves. Up to this point, we have gone through the mythologies of the planters, which extends in an equatorial belt from West Africa all the way across through to Polynesia and on into the New World. So we've examined those myths, and now we're going through the myths of the hunters, and now we're going back in this chapter all the way down to the past, almost as far as we can go. This chapter will be divided into two videos. The first video will comprise subsection part 1, the Shamans of the Great Hunt, and subsection 2, Our Lady of the Mammoths. And then what follows that in the next video will be the discussion of the cult of the Master Bear, the circumpolar cult of the bear cult that originates with the Neanderthals, and the mythologies of the two worlds. So it's got 4 distinct subsections. So it's a long chapter. And what we're going to do in this chapter, I'll get right to the point here, is that we're going to explore Campbell's speculative idea that in the Paleolithic here we have the earliest possible evidence of the earliest war between the sexes. And so we'll take a look at the evidence for that. It's largely speculative and it's based on inference. But sometimes inference is right, and sometimes you get a certain gut feeling about something and you follow that. You're not allowed to do that in academe, which is why Campbell stayed out of academe, which is why I've stayed out of academe, because I prefer to use other modes of the brain than just sheer rationality. I also prefer to use things like intuition, instinct, gut feeling, older, more primordial modes of thought than what the academy allows for. So we begin with the Shamans of the Great Hunt, and Campbell goes and visits the cave of Lascaux, which is all the way at the end of this development. Lascaux is the finale, which begins, here we are this is the zone in France, in and around the Pyrenees, where this all originated circa 35,000 BC and lasted all the way down to about 12,000 BC as the glaciers melted. So we have a huge arc of very stable culture, probably the longest and most stable, long-lasting culture that we've ever seen. About 25,000 years this culture lasted. And Chauvet is at the beginning of it, the oldest of these caves, 35,000 BC, and then Lascaux is at the tail end of it, along with Altamira in the Magdalenian epoch, which terminates. The Magdalenian is 17,000 to 12,000 years ago, and ends as the glaciers are melting. And then in between at the beginning we have the Aurignacian development, followed by the Solutrean and the Magdalenian, and then in Eastern Europe, as we'll see, is going to be a totally separate culture called the Gravettian. So at Lascaux, there are a couple of interesting, spooky images of characters that are obviously not animals. This one here that he shows is of an animal that could not possibly have been a real, actual animal. It's got a gravid belly hanging almost to the ground, and it has these 2 mysterious, long, pointing horns that are not associated with any known species of animal. So it looks like here we have an example of a shamanistic animal master in the herds, governing the herds up above. And then down below, in an area called the Shaft of the Dead Man, Campbell takes a look at this scene, which has been interpreted by such experts as the Abbé Broil as a hunting accident, which Campbell thinks is ridiculous because these are the ultimate archae down in these caves which pattern out for actual events in the phenomenal world. You don't want to depict an accident because it'll cause an accident to actually happen by the principle of magical consciousness. And so here's of course, the famous Shaft of the Dead Man there. You can see the bull that has been eviscerated by a spear through its anus and has come out through its phallus, and intestines are leaking out from that wound. Then we have a man who is shamanistically wrapped in trance state with a bird's head. The shaman often transforms into a bird, and then he's got a staff with a bird on top of it, and a rhino happens to be wandering by, lifting its tail, sending out apparent excrement. So what does this scene mean? And Campbell amplifies it by taking a look at some evidence supplied by Geza Roheim, who wrote a lot about the psychology of the Australian Aborigines, in which he talks about the Australian Aborigines have this thing which they call the pointing bone, which is a secondary phallus, unlike the biological phallus, which creates life. The pointing bone is an imaginary secondary phallus which kills and sends out curses. And it's a stick that is placed between the scrotum in the anus, so right in the area of the perineum, and the shaman master or the hunter puts that stick there and raises it up like a second phallus in order to put a curse on an individual that points in his direction. And he says the shaman will use either semen or excrement to put his victim into a trance or asleep. And while asleep, he will send a magical pointing bone that will penetrate the individual right in his perineum, right between, again, the scrotum and the anus, and penetrate right through there. And that's in the exact position of the staff there that has gone through the bison's rectum. It's gone right through there in the exact position that the pointing bone is sent as a curse by the Australian Aborigines. And not only that, but he supplies some images from Spencer and Gillen of Australians wearing pointing bone headgear that is very similar to the other animal that we saw. And here they are wearing the pointing bone headgear, a pair of horns that goes straight up, intended for victims, and looks just like the horns on this animal master over here. So Campbell thinks that this is all, plus the rhino with the excrement, and the rhino may actually be a familiar of the shaman in trance. And so he thinks that all of this has to do with the magic and mystery of the power of the phallus as a pointing bone, possibly able to cast evil spells on other individuals. Campbell didn't know about the research of Michael Rappengluck, however, the German archaeoastronomer from the University of Munich, who I think it was in the 1990s, saw in this scene rather the constellation of the Summer Triangle, in which we've got three stars, Deneb, Vega, and Altair. And Deneb, he thinks, is the star which is in the constellation of Cygnus. Cygnus is the great swan with wings outspread. And the shaman would then be in the exact same position with his arms outspread, with a bird head, and his eye representing Deneb. Vega is in Lyra, which is the eye of the bull, and then the eye of the bird on the staff at the bottom then corresponds to Aquila, which is the eagle, another bird image. And he thinks those three represent the Summer Triangle. So there may be these other astronomical events going on in this that are mysterious, and who knows exactly what they mean. But it's not a hunting accident, no matter which way you turn it. That's absolutely ridiculous. I'm in agreement with Campbell there. And then so all of this around the art is the parietal art that's painted onto the walls of caves. It's the earliest paintings in the world. But there's another culture involved here, the culture that appears in Eastern Europe, mostly in Germany, of sculpture. Sculpture is not invented in the West, in France. It's invented by the Germans, by these Paleolithic Germans in Eastern Europe. New stuff has come in since Campbell's time at the sites of Klosterla, and or at the sites of Hohenstein-Stadel, where we've got the earliest shamanic man-lion, and Hohenstein-Stadel, Geisenklosterla, and another site that's escaping me right now, where all these tiny little mammoth ivory figurines of horses, mammoths, lions, that are small enough to be held in the palm of the hand, were first invented and carved. They're wonderfully beautiful, elegant, exquisite things. And the earliest Paleolithic goddess figurine, the Venus of Hohlefels, which is a terrible example of craftsmanship. It's just, it's terrible. It's very badly carved. But nonetheless, it is the oldest image. They think it goes back to maybe 37,000 BC, the oldest Venus figurine. So the Venus figurines originate in Germany, in Eastern Europe. The Venus of Willendorf comes from Austria, circa 30,000 BC. And there's another Venus which was recently found also in Germany. I forget what it was called, the Venus of Galgenberg, I think. And it's not very well carved either, but all of these figurines are coming out of Eastern Europe, all these goddess figurines, and it appears as though they eventually migrated south to the southwest to the area and zone of the Pyrenees, where we get the Venus of Lake Puig, the absolute masterpiece of this development, 26,000 BC. Lake Puig is, of course, in France. And then the Venus of Lazelle seems to be the climax of this whole development, which is 20,000 BC at Lazelle, where we find that figure that we saw covered with red ochre holding up the buffalo's horn / moon. And at that same site, perhaps not insignificantly, there's another image of a goddess, the oldest image that we know of an act of human copulation where the goddess is riding cowgirl style on top of a male who is turned down beneath her. She's on top, note, and he's beneath her. The only other cosmological image that corresponds to that I know of is the Egyptian cosmogony, in which the sky is the goddess Nut and the earth is the Ithyphallic god Geb. She's on top, he's below. So there may be a significance to this. So we have another culture, an alien culture to the West that has come in here, temporarily fused together in and around the year, let's say, 26,000 BC, going down to about 20,000 BC. After 20,000 BC, female figurines drop out of Paleolithic Western art. They flourish in the West, especially as they, East rather, especially as they go farther and farther into Russia, into the Ukraine, on into Siberia, as far as to Lake Baikal at Malta in Siberia, dating to about 16,000 BC, flourishes. And this is, of course, the zone of the great mammoth hunters. The great site of Dolny Vestanichi is Eastern European also, and dates from about 27,000 years ago to about 20,000. Interesting that there's a cutoff period here that keeps occurring right about 20,000. Dolny Vestanichi has goddess figurines as well. They were also mammoth hunters, and they lived in, of course, the famous huts composed out of mammoth bones with mammoth skins cut over them. So it appears as though at some point the Western Paleolithic immune system, its metaphysical immune system, ejected and rejected the cult of the goddess, which drops out. She's not there in the Magdalenian. The Magdalenian West is goddess free, which extends from 17,000 down to 12,000. Lascaux has no goddesses. It's based on the power, as we have seen, of the phallus, whereas the cult of the goddess is based on the power of the vulva. At Lazelle, interestingly enough, Campbell suggests that there does appear to be evidence, possibly the earliest evidence in history, of an act of iconoclasm. Most of the images of the goddesses there, and there are a handful of them, look as though they've been defaced and attacked and assaulted. If that's the case, this is the earliest evidence of iconoclasm here, and it may be the case that there was a war. Now, Campbell quotes he goes into this myth about the Tierra del Fuegians, who are hunters in South America, who have had, they have a myth about a story in which at one time the women had all the power and the men had no power. So the myth that he recounts goes that these are hunters. The women, the sun, the moon, were able to walk on the earth a long time ago in human form. They came down and visited. Cran was the sun god. He was the great hunter. And the women's patron deity was the moon goddess Kra. She was able to come down in human form and help them. And they built a sacred house, what's called a kloketten, a large sacred ceremonial lodge house, in which the women lived, and they ruled over the men. They told the men what to do. They had all the access to all the archai. In other words, they had a mastery over the metaphysical domain of witchcraft, shamanism, so forth. So they could do all these things. And the men were apparently powerless, the myth goes. And the women, what they did was they created to intimidate the men these evil spirits, which is basically they put on masks, and they went out pretending they were these supernatural beings to scare the men. And the men think that they're real supernatural beings. Even the sun god is fooled by this, and they all run and hide from this. And this is how the women defended their power. But one day the sun god Cran is out hunting to catch a guanaco. The women require meat, so they make the men go out and get the meat and bring it back to them. He's out hunting a guanaco, and he takes a rest by a lake where he happens to see two of the women out there performing and rehearsing and putting on masks of their deities, their monstrous deities that they use to intimidate the men. And he says, aha! So, this is a deceit. These spirits aren't real, he tells these two women. Shame on you. And he curses them and transforms them into water birds. They disappear and flee as water birds. He goes back to all the men's huts, Cran does, and he tells all the men that these spirits are not real. They are fake. They're masks put on by the women, just like in the movie, by the way, M. Night Shyamalan's film The Village, in which the same motif occurs where the village is being terrorized by these monsters that later turn out to be men wearing masks, controlling the village by terrorizing them with this sort of fake metaphysical immune system. And so Cran tells the men aren't sure what to think. The women find out about this, and the moon goddess Kra tells them, hurry, quick, design the greatest monster of all, the devourer, and send him out to scare the men. So they send this monster out, who's of course a woman wearing a mask. They send her out, and the men aren't sure. They're still kind of scared, but the sun god intervenes and says, no, this is deception. Kill all the women. So he instructs all the men of the tribe. This is the Ona tribe, also known as the Selknam, who are inland nomads. And they proceed then to massacre all of their women, except for the little girls. And in order to prevent the women from ever getting the upper hand again, what they do is they create their own cloquet in their own big lodge, in which they dress up. And then this is what the Ona do in actuality. Who knows whether the women ever actually did this, but the men certainly do it. They created a lodge, a men's secret society that is specifically designed to scare and intimidate the women by dressing up as shamanic monstrous beings that they send forth to scare the women, and that's how they keep them from ever getting the upper hand in the society again. So Campbell points out this myth, and he says there are a number of other occurrences, such as amongst the Pygmies, for example, who also have a myth in which at one time the women had all the power, and the Pygmies, who are also hunters, had to take the power away from them. The Australians also, the Aborigines also have similar myths of the women in the Dreamtime originally having the power to the Ultraringas, the sacred relics. So this is a myth that occurs in a number of cases, and Campbell is wondering about it. And to sort of elucidate it, he quotes, he describes Father Willem Schmidt's idea, who wrote a 12-volume book on the origin of the idea of God, in which Schmidt developed this theory, the origin of the idea of God, in which Schmidt developed this theory that there were three different stages of primitive cultures. Back then they were using that term, primitive cultures. And in the first stage, the simplest hunting societies, he said, there was a basic balance between men and women, as there basically is, he says, amongst the Pygmies. For instance, there's not a sharp dichotomy between men and women amongst the Pygmy hunters, because the women are allowed to participate in the sacred songs. They're allowed to hunt animals along with the men, which is a simple affair of taking nets and trapping animals. It's a relatively easy task for them to do. But also amongst the now extinct Andaman Islanders, the Karnai tribe in southeastern Australia, and he says these are simple tribes in which there was a basic balance of power between men and women and not a sharp differentiation. He thinks this is the sort of primitive earliest tribes were like this. Then he says there's a secondary phase, the phase of the big hunt, where the men now have the power because they have to gather together in large, complex, totemistic clans that have to be very specially organized in order to have the men gather power to hunt big game, such as, let's say, the woolly mammoth. Maybe the mammoth hunters of Eastern Europe were like this. And certain other tribes, the Indians, like the Mandan in North America, who are also extinct, and the Sioux, where the initiation rites into puberty now are strongly polarized. The women have their own private initiation rites centered around their first menstrual cycle, and the men have their own initiation rites that tend to be very brutal and involve things like scarification, usually circumcision, very intense, brutal rites, like the Mandan Indians who used to hang their men from the ceiling of their huts, and they would just hang there with hooks in their flesh that they would hang by and just sort of bleed until they were unconscious. Very severe. The Australian Aranda tribe in Central Australia puts their boys through very serious initiatory ordeals, such that some of the boys just die in the process, being exposed to the intense heat and the severity of fasting and the ordeal. So he says that in this secondary phase, the big hunt required the men to have the power, and so they generally had the power for themselves to organize for these large hunts, and there's a very strong sexual polarization in these societies. The Kung Bushmen, for example, also have a very strong sexual polarization. The women are not allowed to participate in the hunt. The men have to go out and do it. And then he says a third phase must have come in with the tropical planting cultures, where the power shifted to the women because they invented horticulture. They're the ones who were initially scrounging around for roots and nuts and lizards and frogs and berries, and through that process of gathering, they figured out the whole life cycle of plants and the mystery of the planted seed giving birth to plants, and may have invented horticulture. and the power then shifted to them, and it may have appeared to the men, they may have gotten an inferiority complex about it, become threatened by the women's power, and he thinks then the fourth phase would have been the reaction to this that we see in the Ona myth with the formation of men's secret societies, which happen in a bunch of different areas of hunting zones, where the secret societies are not based on puberty rites and initiation so much as, because those are open to all. The men's secret lodges are exclusive. Membership in them is exclusive. It's not available to every man who has reached puberty. And they're trans-tribal very often. They involve numbers of different tribes being members of these same lodges that have come into being for the primary reason of keeping the society, the archive, secret to the men, away from the women, and intimidating the women with spooks and spirits. So, in talking about all this anthropological stuff, then Campbell gets back to the Paleolithic, where he says, perhaps something like this might explain the disappearance of the female figurines from Paleolithic art. It was two separate cultures to begin with anyway, we know that. And for a while they seem to have been fused for about 7,000 years, but by 20,000 years ago, this seems to be the cutoff point for the disappearance of the goddess cult, the attack on Lozel's, the iconoclastic attack on the images at Lozel. There may have been a real sort of war between the sexes here, in which the Western Paleolithic metaphysical immune system ejected and rejected the cult of the goddess, which then continued to flourish. But most of the goddess figurines, if you look at the chronology of each one of these figurines, they're pretty healthy and thorough from about 30,000 down to 20,000, whereupon there's a gap on the chart, and suddenly they're not appearing at all anymore, anywhere, until later on. They start reappearing in Germany and Switzerland about 12,000 years ago at the very end of the Ice Age, but in a very different, highly stylized, abstract, geometrical, crescent-shaped form, without head, without feet, and very, almost look like works of modern art. It's a totally different development. Something has happened there. There's been some way in which the archai, coding for these goddesses, the plump, fat, nude mother goddesses of Eastern Europe during the age of the mammoth, has been damaged somehow. Something has happened to that morphogenetic field which produces these images, and they're not happening anymore from that point on. So something has happened, and Campbell suspects there was some kind of revolt against the goddess 20,000 years ago, something right in there. So that brings us to the upshot of this chapter. The Paleolithic winds down with the Magdalenian Age in Western Europe, the great caves of Lascaux and Altamira, with the animals who are constellations, and the shaman being the primary figure, summoning with the magic of the phallus the herds and putting curses on enemies, and shamans putting curses on enemies and so forth, and that winds all this down. So that brings us to the conclusion of this part of the chapter, and next we'll look at the Neanderthal cult of the master bear.